This opening chapter introduces Caroline Belle Otero at the height of her power in Belle Époque Paris, establishing the magnificent yet suffocating world she has constructed around herself. We witness the elaborate performance required to maintain her status as Europe's most desired courtesan, surrounded by jewels worth kingdoms and admirers who compete for her attention with increasingly desperate gestures. The narrative explores the paradox of her existence. She has achieved unprecedented wealth and influence for a woman of her era, yet feels trapped within the very legend she created. Through vivid descriptions of her nightly ritual of preparation and the constant stream of gifts and supplicants, we see how her beauty has become both weapon and prison. The chapter establishes the central question that will haunt her throughout the story. What is the true cost of transforming oneself into a living fantasy? As she prepares for another evening of performance, hints of the violence and tragedy that follow in her wake begin to surface, setting the stage for the devastating events to come. The suite at the Grand Hotel overlooked the Place Vendôme, where gaslight transformed the evening into a theater of shadows and gold. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of hothouse orchids and the metallic gleam of wealth made manifest. Caroline Otero stood before a mirror that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, watching her maid arrange diamonds in her hair like stars in a manufactured constellation. She was 30 years old and commanded Paris like an empress without a crown. The woman reflected in the glass bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had fled Spain with nothing but determination and a carefully constructed lie about noble blood. That girl was dead, buried beneath layers of silk, sapphires, and the accumulated worship of Europe's most powerful men. "The emeralds tonight, madam?" Sophie asked, her voice reverent as she handled a necklace that had once graced the throat of a Russian Grand Duchess. "No," Otero replied, her voice carrying the faint accent that men found so intoxicating. "The pearls. Let them wonder why I choose simplicity when I could blind them with excess." Every choice was calculated. Every gesture was performance. She had learned that mystery was more valuable than revelation, that the promise of possession was more intoxicating than possession itself. The men who pursued her believed they were hunting a woman. They were actually chasing a carefully crafted illusion that she maintained with the precision of a master jeweler setting stones. The evidence of her conquests filled the room like trophies in a hunter's lodge. Flowers arrived hourly from crowned heads and industrial barons. Jewelry boxes accumulated on every surface, each containing some bauble meant to capture her attention for a moment longer than the last. Love letters piled up, written in a dozen languages by men who commanded armies and owned railways, but reduced themselves to schoolboys in her presence. She lifted a telegram from the silver tray beside her mirror. Prince Albert of Monaco, begging for the honor of her company at his casino. She set it aside without reading beyond the first line. Another from the German Kaiser's youngest brother, promising her a castle if she would visit Berlin. Into the wastepaper basket it went, joining a dozen similar offers. "They think wealth can purchase me," she murmured to her reflection. "They do not understand that I am wealth. I am the thing they cannot buy, because I have already bought myself." The transformation had not been accidental. Every franc she earned was invested with the cold calculation of a banker building an empire. She owned properties in 3 countries, held shares in shipping companies and steel mills, maintained accounts in banks from London to St. Petersburg. She had turned her body into a business and her beauty into a currency that never depreciated, or so she told herself. But standing there in her gilded cage, surrounded by the evidence of her triumph, she felt the familiar hollow ache that no amount of adoration could fill. The men who worshipped her saw only what they wanted to see, a goddess of desire, a creature of pure sensuality, a fantasy made flesh. None of them knew about the nightmares that woke her screaming, about the way she scrubbed her skin raw after certain encounters, about the voice in her head that whispered she was still that violated child from Galicia, no matter how many diamonds she wore. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Sophie answered, returning with a card on a silver tray. Count Francesco di San Martino requests an audience, madam, he says. It is urgent. Otero glanced at the card. She remembered the young Italian, beautiful in the way of thoroughbred horses, wealthy in the way of old families, and dangerous in the way of men who had never been denied anything they truly wanted. She had been avoiding him for weeks, sensing something desperate in his pursuit that differed from the usual aristocratic game of conquest. "Tell him I am indisposed," she said, turning back to the mirror. "He says he will wait, madame. He has been in the lobby for 3 hours." Through the window, she could see the carriages lining up along the street. Men in evening dress emerged like moths drawn to flame, all hoping for a glimpse of her shadow behind the curtains. They looked so small from her height, so insignificant, yet she knew that each one possessed the power to destroy lives with a word, to topple governments with a signature, to command the fate of thousands. And here they were, reduced to supplicants outside her door. "Let him wait," she said finally. "If he truly desires an audience with Belle Otero, he must learn that such privileges cannot be purchased with patience alone." She turned from the window, and for a moment the mask slipped. In the mirror's reflection, she saw not the legendary courtesan, but a woman trapped within her own success, surrounded by admirers who would abandon her the moment her beauty faded or her mystique cracked. She had built her fortune on the foundation of male desire, but desire was as changeable as weather, as reliable as dice. The question that haunted her quiet moments pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight. When the performance finally ended, when the last admirer departed, and the final jewel was sold, what would remain of the woman beneath the legend? She pushed the thought away, as she always did, and reached for her gloves. The evening awaited, and Belle Otero had a role to play. But as she prepared to descend into the world of her admirers, she could not shake the feeling that she was walking towards something that would change everything, something that would transform her from hunter into hunted, from goddess into cautionary tale. The game was about to become deadly serious, and for the first time in years, she was not certain she held the winning hand. Chapter 2. The Price of Worship. The narrative delves deeper into the psychological mechanics of Otero's existence, exploring the emotional toll of her profession and the dangerous addiction to gambling that provides her only escape from the suffocating performance of her daily life. This chapter chronicles her systematic conquest of Europe's elite while revealing the growing cracks in her carefully constructed armor. We witness the intricate dance of power and submission that defines her relationships, where she maintains absolute control while secretly feeling more trapped with each conquest. The gambling becomes both rebellion and self-punishment, the only arena where she can feel genuine emotion. The chapter builds toward its devastating climax with the suicide of Count Francesco di San Martino, a young Italian nobleman whose obsession with her leads to tragedy. This event marks the beginning of the curse that will follow her throughout her career, the phenomenon of men literally dying for her love. As she stands over his body on the rain-soaked cobblestones of Monte Carlo, she realizes that her beauty has become a loaded weapon, and she may no longer control where it aims. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly beyond the casino's windows, dark water meeting darker sky in a line that seemed to divide the world between possibility and void. Inside the gilded halls of Monte Carlo, Belle Otero sat at the baccarat table with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. The difference was that here, she was both doctor and patient, cutting into her own soul with each turn of the cards. She had arrived in Monaco 3 months earlier, fleeing the suffocating attention of Paris society and the increasingly desperate pursuit of Count Francesco di San Martino. The young Italian had progressed from admirer to obsession, appearing at her performances with the regularity of clockwork, sending gifts that grew more extravagant and more personal with each passing day. His latest offering, a ruby bracelet that had belonged to his grandmother, accompanied by a letter proposing marriage, had finally driven her to seek refuge in the principality's glittering playground. But Francesco had followed her here, as she had known he would. She could feel his presence in the casino even now, hovering at the edge of her vision like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. His devotion had transformed from flattering to frightening, carrying with it the weight of genuine emotion that she had no idea how to handle. She was accustomed to desire, to lust, to the calculated passions of men who treated love as another form of commerce. Francesco's feelings were different, raw, desperate, and utterly sincere. The cards fell with the whisper of silk against marble. She won, then lost, then won again, the rhythm of chance providing the only honest conversation she had experienced in months. Here at the table, stripped of pretense and performance, she could simply exist in the pure mathematics of risk and reward. The other players watched her with a mixture of fascination and fear, understanding that they were witnessing something beyond mere gambling. They were watching a woman wage war against herself. Mademoiselle Otero, a familiar voice, spoke behind her. She did not turn, but her spine stiffened as Francesco approached. He looked haggard, his usual aristocratic composure cracked like a broken mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the back of her chair. "You have been avoiding me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accusation and pleading in equal measure. "I avoid many things, Count," she replied without looking at him, her attention fixed on the cards being dealt. "Boredom, poverty, conversations that serve no purpose. I love you." The words fell into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone at the table. Other players glanced up, sensing drama more intoxicating than any game of chance. "Love is a luxury I cannot afford," she said, finally turning to meet his gaze. What she saw there made her breath catch, not the calculated desire she was accustomed to, but something far more dangerous. Francesco looked at her as if she were salvation itself, as if her acceptance could transform his entire existence. "I have left my regiment," he continued, his voice growing more desperate. "I have told my family about us. I am prepared to give up everything. My title, my inheritance, my country, if you will only say yes." The casino's ambient noise seemed to fade around them, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing and the distant whisper of waves against the rocks below. Otero felt something cold settle in her chest, a recognition of the precipice they had approached. She had encountered infatuation before, had navigated the treacherous waters of masculine obsession with the skill of an experienced captain. But this was different. This was the kind of devotion that destroyed lives, that toppled kingdoms, that left bodies in its wake. "Francesco," she said, her voice gentler than usual, "you do not love me. You love an idea, a performance, a woman who exists only in your imagination. I am not her. I am not anyone's salvation." "You are wrong," he whispered, his hand reaching toward her face before stopping just short of contact. "I see you, the real you. Behind all the jewels and the performance, I see the woman who is afraid, who is lonely, who needs someone to what?" She snapped, the gentleness evaporating. "To rescue me? To complete me? To give my life meaning?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "I am not a fairy tale princess waiting for a prince, Francesco. I am a businesswoman who has built an empire from nothing. I do not need rescuing. I need customers." The cruelty of her words was intentional, a blade designed to cut the cord that bound him to her. But instead of retreating, Francesco stepped closer, his eyes blazing with the fervor of a man who had passed beyond reason. "I will not give up," he said. "I cannot. Without you, I am nothing. Without you, Life has no meaning. She stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of the trap she had inadvertently set. Her beauty, her mystery, her carefully crafted persona had created something she had never intended: genuine, destructive love. She had turned herself into a drug, and Francesco was an addict facing withdrawal. "Then you are a fool," she said finally, gathering her reticule and preparing to leave. "And I do not associate with fools." She walked away from the table, from the casino, from Francesco's desperate gaze, but she could not walk away from the certainty that something terrible was approaching. The young count's obsession had crossed a line from troublesome to dangerous, and she found herself in unfamiliar territory, a place where her usual weapons of manipulation and control seemed powerless. That night, she stood on the balcony of her suite at the Hotel de Paris, watching the moonlight paint silver paths across the Mediterranean. The beauty of the scene felt like a mockery, a reminder of all the things her wealth and fame could not purchase: peace, safety, the simple pleasure of existing without performance. A gunshot cracked the night air like thunder, echoing off the hotel's facade and rolling across the water. She knew, even before the screams began, even before the crowd gathered in the street below, exactly what had happened. Francesco had found his escape from the unbearable weight of unrequited love, and in doing so, he had transformed her from courtesan into legend, from woman into myth. As she watched the police arrive and the journalists begin to swarm, she understood that her life had just changed irrevocably. She was no longer simply La Belle Otero, the most desired woman in Europe. She had become something far more dangerous and far more valuable, the woman men killed themselves for. The curse had begun, and there would be no escape from its consequences. Chapter 3. The Weight of Blood. In the aftermath of Count Francesco's suicide, Otero finds herself transformed from celebrated courtesan into a figure of both fascination and fear across European society. This chapter explores the paradoxical nature of scandal. Rather than destroying her reputation, Francesco's death elevates her to mythic status, making her more desirable than ever before. However, the psychological toll is devastating. She begins to understand that she has become something monstrous, a creature whose very existence brings destruction to those who love her. Her gambling addiction intensifies as she seeks escape from the guilt that threatens to consume her. The chapter chronicles a series of increasingly desperate men who compete not just for her attention, but for the privilege of risking everything for her love. The crisis comes when a second man attempts suicide, followed by a third, creating a pattern that the European press seizes upon with savage delight. As the bodies accumulate and her legend grows, Otero realizes she has lost control of the narrative of her own life. She is no longer a woman making choices, but a force of nature, leaving devastation in her wake. The chapter ends with her standing in her mirror, seeing not the celebrated beauty, but the frightened girl from Galicia who started this journey, finally understanding that revenge has a price she never calculated. The newspapers called it the curse of La Belle Otero, and the phrase spread across Europe like wildfire. Within days of Francesco's death, her name was on every tongue from St. Petersburg to London, whispered in drawing rooms and shouted from street corners. The story had everything the public craved: beauty, wealth, passion, and tragedy served up in perfect proportion for mass consumption. She sat in her suite, reading the headlines with a mixture of horror and fascination. The siren of Monte Carlo claims her first victim, proclaimed Le Figaro. Beauty more deadly than poison, declared the Times of London. Her photograph appeared on front pages across the continent, usually accompanied by lurid accounts of her conquests and breathless speculation about which nobleman might be next to fall under her spell. The reaction was not what she had expected. Instead of scandal destroying her career, it had transformed her into something unprecedented, a living legend whose very existence seemed to defy the natural order. Men who had previously admired her from a respectful distance now pursued her with renewed intensity, as if Francesco's death had proven rather than disproven her desirability. They wanted to test themselves against her, to prove they were strong enough to possess what had destroyed a count. Her fees tripled overnight, invitations multiplied. Theaters across Europe competed to book her, not just for her performances, but for the crowds her notoriety would draw. She had become the most famous woman on the continent, but the fame felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The guilt was worse than the fame. She found herself replaying the final conversation with Francesco obsessively, searching for words she might have said differently, gestures she might have made to prevent the tragedy. But beneath the guilt lay something more disturbing, a cold recognition that part of her had known this would happen. She had seen the desperation in his eyes, had recognized the dangerous intensity of his devotion, and she had chosen cruelty over kindness, because cruelty was safer. To escape the suffocating weight of her thoughts, she turned to the gaming tables with increased desperation. The casino became her sanctuary, the only place where she could lose herself in pure mathematics and forget, temporarily, the human cost of her success. She played with reckless intensity, winning and losing fortunes with equal indifference, seeking only the momentary peace that came when the cards demanded her complete attention. It was during one of these marathon sessions that Baron von Richter approached her table. He was a Prussian industrialist with steel-gray eyes and the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military training. Unlike most of her admirers, he did not seem intimidated by her legend. If anything, Francesco's death appeared to have emboldened him. "Mademoiselle Otero," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I have a proposition for you." She glanced at him without interest, her attention focused on the cards being dealt. "I am not conducting business tonight, Baron. I am gambling." "This is gambling," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I propose a wager between us. If I win, you spend a week as my guest in Berlin. If you win, I will purchase your debts from the casino and cancel them entirely." The offer was staggering. Her gambling losses had mounted to nearly 200,000 francs, a sum that would have bankrupted lesser fortunes. But more than the money, it was the Baron's casual confidence that intrigued her. He was treating her not as a goddess to be worshipped, but as an equal to be challenged. "And if I refuse your wager?" she asked. "Then you continue to lose money you cannot afford to lose, and I continue to be bored by women who offer no challenge." He smiled, and she saw something predatory in his expression. "Come now, mademoiselle. Surely the woman who drove a count to suicide is not afraid of a simple game of cards?" The challenge was expertly delivered, appealing to both her pride and her addiction. She knew she should walk away, should recognize the trap being set. But the familiar thrill was already coursing through her veins, the intoxicating rush that came with high stakes and uncertain outcomes. "One hand," she said. "Baccarat. Winner takes all." They played in silence, surrounded by a crowd that sensed they were witnessing something significant. The Baron's face remained impassive as the cards were revealed, but she saw his pupils dilate slightly when her hand proved superior. He had lost, and lost spectacularly, but instead of anger or disappointment, his expression showed something that chilled her to the bone: satisfaction. "Congratulations, mademoiselle," he said, rising from his chair. "You have won more than money tonight. You have won my complete devotion." The words carried an echo of Francesco's final declaration, and she felt the familiar cold dread settling in her chest. She had not escaped the pattern. She had simply found a new victim. The Baron's challenge had not been about winning or losing. It had been about binding himself to her through the ritual of risk and defeat. Over the following weeks, Von Richter pursued her with the systematic efficiency of a military campaign. Unlike Francesco's romantic desperation, the Baron's courtship was calculated and relentless. He appeared wherever she went, sent gifts that demonstrated intimate knowledge of her preferences, and spoke of their future together with the certainty of a man discussing established fact. The second suicide attempt came on New Year's Eve. A young French diplomat named Henri Dubois, driven to despair by her continued rejection of his advances, tried to throw himself from the casino's balcony. He was saved by the intervention of security guards, but the incident made headlines across Europe. La Belle Otero strikes again, proclaimed the sensationalist press. The third attempt followed within a month. A Russian Grand Duke, bankrupted by his efforts to impress her, put a pistol to his head in the lobby of the Hôtel de Paris. The gun misfired, but the message was clear. Her very existence had become a catalyst for male self-destruction. Standing in her suite that night, surrounded by flowers and jewelry from men she barely remembered, Otero finally understood the full scope of what she had become. She was no longer a woman making choices about her life and career. She was a force of nature, a hurricane that destroyed everything in its path, regardless of intention or desire. The frightened girl from Galicia, who had sworn never to be powerless again, had accumulated so much power that she could no longer control its effects. She walked to her dressing table and stared at her reflection, seeing past the carefully applied cosmetics and expensive jewelry to the person beneath. For the first time in years, she saw Agostina, the violated child who had turned her trauma into a weapon, who had sought revenge against all men for the crimes of one. "What have I done?" she whispered to the mirror. "What have I become?" The reflection offered no answers, only the cold beauty that had launched 1,000 scandals, and would, she now understood, leave a trail of broken men in its wake until the day she died. She had sought to transform herself from victim to victor, but in the process she had become something far worse than either. She had become the thing that creates victims, the source of the very powerlessness she had fought so hard to escape. The curse was not something imposed upon her by fate or circumstance. It was something she had created, nurtured, and unleashed upon the world. And now, as she stared into her own eyes, she realized that she was as trapped by it as any of the men who had died in her name. Chapter 4. The Descent into Darkness. By 1905, Otero's reputation as the woman men kill themselves for has made her simultaneously the most famous and most feared woman in Europe. This chapter chronicles her psychological unraveling as the weight of multiple suicides and her own complicity in them drives her towards self-destruction. Her gambling addiction spirals completely out of control, becoming less about the thrill of risk and more about punishing herself for the lives she has destroyed. The fortune she spent years accumulating begins to evaporate at the gaming tables as she engages in increasingly reckless behavior. Her relationships become toxic and mutually destructive, particularly her affair with Prince Alexei Volkonsky, a Russian aristocrat whose own darkness matches her own. Together, they embark on a shared journey of slow-motion suicide through alcohol, gambling, and violence. The chapter explores themes of guilt, self-loathing, and the way success can become unbearable when built on foundations of pain. The twist emerges as we discover that Otero has been keeping detailed records of her lover's secrets, not out of sentiment, but as insurance. Yet even as her fortune crumbles, she refuses to use this information, revealing a moral line she will not cross despite her desperate circumstances. The chapter ends with her alone and nearly bankrupt, having destroyed everything she built in a futile attempt to escape the guilt that haunts her. The casino at 4 a.m. was a graveyard of broken dreams, its gilded halls echoing with the hollow laughter of those who had lost everything, and the desperate whispers of those still convinced they could win it back. La Belle Otero sat at the Chemin de Fer Tabac like a queen holding court in hell, surrounded by the debris of her own systematic self-destruction. 7 years had passed since Francesco's death, and the curse that bore her name had claimed 6 more lives. The European press tracked each tragedy with ghoulish enthusiasm, turning her existence into a serialized horror story that sold newspapers from London to Constantinople. She had become less a woman than a phenomenon, a living embodiment of the dangerous intersection between beauty and death. The fortune she had spent decades accumulating was disappearing with mathematical precision. Each night brought fresh losses, each dawn revealed new depths to which she was willing to sink in pursuit of. What? She no longer remembered what she was chasing at these tables. The thrill had long since faded, replaced by a grim compulsion that felt more like penance than pleasure. Prince Alexei Volkonsky sat beside her, his aristocratic features carved from marble and shadow. He was perhaps the only man in Europe who understood her particular form of damnation, having embarked on his own journey toward destruction after killing a friend in a duel over a woman he had never loved. They had found each other 6 months earlier, 2 damaged souls recognizing their shared commitment to elegant ruin. "You're bleeding money like a stuck pig," Alexei observed, his Russian accent making the crude words sound almost poetic. He raised his glass of vodka in a mock toast. "At this rate, you'll be bankrupt by Christmas." "One can only hope," she replied, pushing another stack of chips forward, with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for self-annihilation. Poverty might be restful after all this wealth. The cards fell with their familiar whisper of silk against felt. She lost again, naturally. The pattern had become so predictable that she sometimes wondered if the dealers were cheating, not against her, but for her, trying to slow her descent into financial oblivion. But no, the mathematics of chance were simply asserting themselves after years of improbable luck. The house always won eventually, and she had finally become just another gambler learning that lesson the hard way. Her behavior had become increasingly erratic over the past year. She appeared drunk at performances, forgetting choreography she had executed flawlessly for decades. She insulted patrons who had once been devoted admirers, burning bridges with the casual cruelty of someone who no longer cared about consequences. She had broken contracts, alienated theater managers, and destroyed relationships that had taken years to build. The newspapers that had once celebrated her now chronicled her decline with the same enthusiasm they had once devoted to her conquests. The fall of La Belle Otero read one headline. From goddess to grotesque proclaimed another. The public that had worshipped her now consumed stories of her downfall with the savage appetite of spectators at a gladiatorial combat. But the most devastating loss was not financial or professional. It was the slow erosion of her ability to feel anything at all. The guilt that had once tormented her had calcified into a cold indifference that was somehow worse than pain. She moved through her days like an actress, playing a role she no longer understood, going through the motions of living while feeling increasingly disconnected from her own existence. "I have something that might interest you," Alexei said, leaning closer. His breath smelled of vodka and expensive tobacco. "A private game tomorrow night. Very high stakes. The kind of money that could either save you or finish you completely." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. "And which outcome are you hoping for, my dear prince? Does it matter?" He replied with a smile that held no warmth. "We both know how this story ends. The only question is whether we choose our destruction or let it choose us." Later that night, alone in her suite at the Hôtel de Paris, she stood before a wall safe that contained the last remnants of her empire. Not jewels or cash, but something potentially more valuable, a collection of leather-bound journals filled with the secrets of kings and kaisers, industrialists and aristocrats who had shared their vulnerabilities in the intimacy of her bed. She had never intended to become a blackmailer, but powerful men had a tendency to confess their sins to beautiful women, and she had developed the habit of recording everything, not out of sentiment, but out of survival instinct. These journals contained enough explosive information to topple governments, ruin reputations, and extract fortunes from those who had once sought to possess her. A publisher in Paris had offered her 500,000 francs for her memoirs, with the understanding that she would name names and reveal secrets. It would be enough to restore her fortune, to return to the gaming tables with her head held high, to buy back some measure of the security she had gambled away. She opened one of the journals at random, reading her own handwriting from a decade earlier. "The Kaiser wept tonight," one entry read. "He spoke of his fear that the alliance with Austria will lead to war. He believes the French are planning something, but he cannot prove it. He asked me to spy for him, to use my connections in Paris to gather information. I told him I would consider it." The words stared back at her from the page, a reminder of the power she had once wielded and the trust that had been placed in her. These men had seen her not just as a courtesan, but as a confidante, someone who could be trusted with their deepest fears and most dangerous secrets. To betray that trust now, even for survival, would be to complete her transformation from victim to monster. She closed the journal and returned it to the safe. Whatever else she had become, whatever lines she had already crossed, she would not become a blackmailer. Some degradations were worse than poverty, some betrayals more final than financial ruin. The decision left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the jewelry she still wore, and even those would be gone soon enough if her gambling continued at its current pace. She had perhaps 3 months before complete destitution, 3 months to find some way to survive in a world that was rapidly forgetting her name. Standing at her window, looking out at the Mediterranean under a canopy of stars, she felt something she had not experienced in years, a strange kind of peace. She had lost almost everything, but in refusing to sell the secrets that could have saved her, she had retained something more valuable than money. She had kept faith with the frightened, lonely men who had trusted her with their vulnerabilities, and in doing so, she had perhaps found the first genuine moral victory of her adult life. It was cold comfort, but it was all she had. Tomorrow would bring fresh losses, new humiliations, another step closer to the poverty she had fought so hard to escape. But tonight, for the first time in years, she could look at herself in the mirror without feeling like a complete stranger. The woman staring back at her was broken, and rapidly approaching irrelevance. But she was not, despite everything, a traitor. In a life built on performance and deception, that single truth felt like a small miracle. Chapter 5. The Last Performance. The final chapter brings Otero's story full circle, from the heights of fame to the quiet dignity of survival. Set in 1965, we find her at 97 years old, living in poverty in a small hotel room in Nice, forgotten by a world that has moved far beyond the Belle Époque. The narrative explores the psychology of aging and irrelevance, the way society discards women who can no longer perform youth and beauty. Yet in her decline, Otero achieves something she never possessed at the height of her fame: genuine peace. Stripped of wealth, beauty, and the burden of performance, she rediscovers aspects of herself that had been buried beneath the legend of La Belle Otero. Through visits from journalists seeking scandalous stories and her reflections on the choices that shaped her life, she comes to understand both her agency in her destruction and the limited options available to a woman of her circumstances. The resolution is bittersweet, but ultimately redemptive. She has survived, which is itself a victory. The final scene shows her preparing for death, not with regret, but with the understanding that she lived fully, burned brightly, and paid the full price for her choices. Her last reflection captures the essential tragedy and triumph of her existence. She was desired by thousands, but truly known by none, including herself. The room at the Hotel Novelty was smaller than the dressing rooms she had once occupied at the Folies-Bergerie, but it was clean and quiet, and the afternoon light that filtered through the thin curtains was kind to her ancient hands. Caroline Otero sat in a wicker chair by the window, mending a dress that had seen better decades. her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency learned in childhood and remembered in age. She was 97 years old, and the face that had launched 1,000 scandals now showed every one of those years. The famous curves had long since surrendered to gravity. The luminous skin had become tissue paper. The dark eyes that once commanded emperors now simply looked tired. To the other residents of the modest hotel, she was just the old Spanish woman in room 12 who fed pigeons and occasionally told improbable stories about dining with kings. The transformation from legend to invisibility had been gradual but inexorable. The First World War had changed everything, turning the Belle Époque into a historical curiosity and her particular brand of theatrical sensuality into something quaint and outdated. The men who had once bankrupted themselves for her attention were dead in trenches or aged beyond recognition. A new generation had emerged with different tastes, different values, different gods to worship. Her fortune, what remained of it after the gambling, had evaporated during the economic chaos following the war. Property sold for fractions of their value, investments worthless, jewelry pawned to pay for increasingly modest lodgings. She had performed in smaller and smaller venues, accepted lesser and lesser roles, until finally the offers stopped coming altogether. The world had simply moved on, leaving her behind like a beautiful dress that had gone out of style. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She set aside her mending and opened it to find a young man with a notebook and the eager expression of someone who believed he was about to uncover buried treasure. "Mademoiselle Otero?" He said in French accented with American enthusiasm. "I'm James Mitchell from Life magazine. I'm writing a piece about the great courtesans of the Belle Époque, and I was hoping—" "I am not giving interviews about the past," she said, beginning to close the door. "Please," he said, placing his hand against the doorframe. "I'm not looking for scandal. I'm trying to understand what it was really like, to live that life, to be that famous. The world has forgotten so much about that era." Something in his tone, respectful rather than prurient, made her pause. She studied his face, seeing genuine curiosity rather than the voyeuristic hunger she had learned to recognize in journalists. After a moment, she stepped aside and gestured him into the room. "You want to understand?" she said, settling back into her chair. "Then sit." Understanding requires patience, and patience requires time. He perched on the room's single other chair, notebook ready, but she waved away his preparations. "Put that away," she said. "If you want to understand La Belle Otero, you must first understand that she was a performance. A magnificent performance, perhaps, but a performance nonetheless. The woman you are speaking to now is what remained when the curtain finally fell." She looked out the window at the Mediterranean, still blue after all these years, still beautiful despite everything that had happened beneath its gaze. "They called me the woman men killed themselves for," she continued. "Do you know how many actually died? 7. 7 men out of the thousands who claimed to love me. The newspapers made it sound like I left a trail of corpses across Europe, but the truth is more prosaic. Men kill themselves for many reasons: debt, shame, cowardice, despair. I was simply a convenient excuse, a story they could tell themselves that made their final choice seem romantic rather than pathetic." The young journalist leaned forward, clearly expecting more dramatic revelations, but she disappointed him with her matter-of-fact tone. "You want to know what it was really like?" she asked. "It was work. Exhausting, dangerous, soul-destroying work. Every smile was calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every word chosen for maximum effect. I turned myself into a product, and products must be constantly maintained, constantly marketed, constantly improved. There was no rest, no privacy, no moment when I could simply exist without performing." "But the wealth," he said. "The jewels, the palaces, the power, surely that was worth something?" She laughed, a sound like autumn leaves rustling. "Wealth is a tool, young man. It can buy comfort, security, even a certain kind of freedom. But it cannot buy peace. It cannot buy love. It cannot buy the ability to look in a mirror and recognize the person staring back at you. She stood and walked to the small dresser, opening a drawer to reveal a single photograph, herself at the height of her beauty, dripping in diamonds, surrounded by admirers at some long-forgotten gala. This woman, she said, holding up the photograph, was the most famous courtesan in Europe. She dined with kings, owned properties in 3 countries, commanded fees that could have fed villages. She was powerful, independent, feared and desired, and she was the loneliest person I have ever known. She returned the photograph to the drawer and closed it with finality. The tragedy of my life, she continued, was not that I lost my fortune or my beauty or my fame. The tragedy was that I spent so many years being what other people wanted me to be that I forgot who I actually was. I became La Belle Otero so completely that Agostina disappeared entirely. And now? The journalist asked softly, "Have you found her again?" She considered the question, looking around the modest room with its peeling wallpaper and threadbare carpet. "I am still looking," she said finally. "At 97, I am still trying to discover who I might have been if I had made different choices. But perhaps that is enough, the search itself. The possibility that it is never too late to begin again." After the journalist left, she sat alone as darkness fell over Nice. The Mediterranean was invisible now, but she could hear it, the eternal whisper of waves against stone. The same sound that had accompanied her first arrival in Monte Carlo 7 years earlier. She thought about the girl from Galicia who had sworn never to be powerless again, who had transformed trauma into triumph and vulnerability into strength. That girl had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, had achieved wealth and fame, and a kind of immortality that would outlast her physical existence. But the price had been everything that made life worth living: love, friendship, peace, the simple pleasure of existing without performance. Had it been worth it? The question that had haunted her for decades seemed less important now, in the quiet of her final years. She had made choices with the information available to her, had done what seemed necessary for survival, had played the hand she was dealt with skill and determination. The consequences, both magnificent and terrible, belonged to her, and she accepted them without apology or regret. As she prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The face looking back at her was ancient, lined, ordinary, but for the first time in decades, she recognized it. This was Agostina, the frightened child, the determined young woman, the survivor who had endured everything the world could throw at her and was still standing. "Hello," she whispered to her reflection. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." The woman in the mirror smiled, not the practiced, seductive smile of La Belle Otero, but something simpler and more genuine. It was the smile of someone who had finally, after nearly a century of searching, found her way home. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 days later, leaving behind no fortune, no jewels, no earthly treasures except for a single photograph and the fading memory of a legend that had once set the world on fire. The newspapers that had chronicled her scandals barely noted her passing. The world had moved on, as worlds do, finding new gods to worship and new scandals to consume. But in the quiet of that small room overlooking the Mediterranean, something important had been accomplished. A frightened girl from Galicia had finally been reunited with the woman she had become, and in that reunion, both had found the peace that had eluded them for so long. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and in the darkness that followed, there was finally, at last, rest.